I'll do it this way. Oh, right. Are we there? Can people hear me? Hello? Right, okay. Hopefully people can hear me properly. I have no idea. Good, right. Sorry for the delay, everybody. For some reason, XSplit upstairs in the library wasn't cooperating at all. It just, I don't know what it was doing. It just crashed. Well, it didn't even crash, to be honest. It refused to load. Let's put it that way. Yeah, once it refused to load, that was basically it. I tried updating it. It just decided it was going to crash out. The updater crashed out the computer, so I was left with no choice but to run downstairs. And yeah, we've ended up in my normal recording studio. And yes, thank you, people. Thanks telling me it's messy. That really helps after half an hour, 45 minutes of stress. Yeah, please keep comments about the state of the room to yourself. Honestly, it's, you're not supposed to see this, you're supposed to see the library. We're in the middle of getting a new, well, we have a dog now. You may hear him, you may see him. He's currently chewing on a stick over there. So yeah, this is why I'm supposed to be doing it upstairs. Anyway, that's the situation. We're in the backup studio, and yeah, surprisingly, the floor is remarkably clean. This is actually a really bad camera angle for all of the mess in the background. But anyway. Is that a bronze sword? Yes, that's actually 2 bronze swords. There's a Ewart Park sword completed and what they term a bronze rapier uncompleted, so I have to polish it, sharpen it, and give it scales. And there's a mace as well. Anyway, you guys know the drill. We are doing Patreon alternate history questions, then grabbing super chats, then going into everything else. Bala Rasmussen, yeah, there are pluses and minuses to having a dog. Here he comes. Here he comes. What are you doing? Please don't eat my pajama top. It's okay. It's okay. You're right, Floppy. There you go. If he sits quietly on the bed, I may let you see him later on. But he's having fun. Dog photos required. Well, I can probably put one up on XSplit later on. Anyway, let's get into questions. Yes. Right, so F-19A Ghost Rider, his question is, during the attack on Pearl Harbor, USS Nevada attempted to escape out to sea, but it ended up being beached whilst still in harbor. Also correct. Just pull the questions there so I'm actually looking at the camera. Had Nevada made it out to sea, what would her officers have done? Probably supervised the evacuation of the ship as it sank in deep water. Go to Lahania Rose Anchorage. It wasn't in a state to do that. Secondly, if Nevada had been sunk whilst in the harbour channel, how long would it have taken to clear the channel, and would this have been very devastating to the Pacific Fleet? In the immediate term, it would have been a big problem if Nevada had gone broadside on in the harbour entrance. In the medium to long term, it wouldn't have been too much of a problem because the harbour entrance is still, if it's still within the harbour entrance, it's relatively shallow, so salvage work could begin. But also, although the actual channel is somewhat narrow and would have been blocked, the bottom of Pearl Harbor in that area is actually quite easy to dredge. So in the medium term, they could have dredged around her whilst also trying to salvage her. But if she'd made it out to sea, yeah, she was already in a sinking condition. The Japanese, if they saw a mobile battleship, would have gone, yep, that's definitely a target. So she would have gone down in deep water and been completely unsalvageable at that point. Daniel Taylor asking, did I bring the Iron Brew down with me? Yes, I did. And Bill Drat asks, pointing out that apparently it is Anzac Day. Off the top of my head, given that that's in Australia and given the time, does that mean is Anzac Day the 24th or the 25th? Because it's the 24th here, but I suspect in Australia it may actually be the 25th. Right, so that's F-19A Ghost Rider's question. So yeah, it would have been annoying, but it wouldn't have devastated the Pacific Fleet. The Panda Man asks, Panda Man 2000 in fact, can you recommend a book or two on Royal Navy uniforms in the 1700s? I can't recommend specifically a book on Royal Navy uniforms in the 1700s because I don't think anyone's written something that specific. I can recommend a few books on Royal Navy uniforms generally. So Pandaman 2000, if you're watching this, if you want to drop me an email or Discord message or Patreon message, I can send you some links to those books. Anzac's 25th. Okay, well, enjoy the enjoy Anzac Day on the 25th. It will be Anzac Day in 3.5 hours in the UK. So, Klaus asks, 30th of March 1939. In addition to USS Hornet, the United States orders 2 light carriers to help quickly build out the carrier fleet whilst they're waiting for the Essexes. Assuming they commission it around the time that Hornet does in October 1941, how might they have looked? Would they be similar to the Independence class with worse anti-aircraft guns, and how much difference would they have made in World War II? I mean, it depends what kind of hulls they would have used, because 30th of March 1939... let me just check something quickly. Yeah, that's over a year before the first of the Clevelands gets laid down. So where they're going to find the hull is going to be an interesting one. It's going to have to basically be a purpose-built hull, which means if they're planning it, obviously long-term, they can just, plan a light carrier design. They do have a number of them. The carrier cruisers, they could, slightly rehash that, not include the 6.6-inch or 8.8-inch, and just extend the flight deck and hangar out. If it's an emergency, then they're going to have some interesting problems. But yeah, if they do that, assuming you get something vaguely like the Independence class, which is relatively reasonable, so let's say 32 knots, 36 aircraft. What difference would they have made in World War II? Well, given when the Independences historically come online, post sort of first third to mid 1943, they're not going to have a huge impact. It's in 1941 that they're going to have the biggest impact, because with 2 extra hulls, if the US Navy has the fuel oil and the fleet oilers to send them out, where are they going to be the most used? They're probably not going to send them on the Doolittle raid, although they might. I mean, you could say, given that Enterprise was there to ride escort for Hornet, you could maybe say they send the 2 light carriers loaded with fighters for the Doolittle raid, at which point Enterprise gets to be at Coral Sea. That might change Coral Sea. Alternatively, you might have the historical Doolittle raid and you have the 2 light carriers with Yorktown and Lexington. Will that be enough to save Lexington? Don't know, possibly. And you might have one or both of them present for Midway, which might mean additional cover for Yorktown at Midway, which might save Midway. So overall, things might look pretty good. Obviously, they are more vulnerable. If they get caught by Japanese aircraft, they're going to be much easier to sink. So there could be a huge range of differences. I mean, that you could have, instead of Yorktown being damaged at Coral Sea, the Japanese spot these 2 light carriers, go after them, bang, gone. Okay, didn't make much odds at all, other than a slightly less damaged Yorktown. it could equally be that, as I said, if they load them up with Wildcats and they provide a big cap, you might save Lexington, you might save the damage to Yorktown, you might therefore have more carriers available for Midway, and you might not lose anything at Midway, and everything tumbles on and on and on and on. Dr. Clark says, Jennifer Daly has written a book on Royal Navy uniforms, but not sure if it's been published yet. Right, so let me just make sure Discord's up because people are sending me questions that way. Right. Megascrow asks, hybrid, that was, if you are hearing that howling, whining noise, that's Floppy settling down. Megascrow asks, the hybrid technologies that may or may not have existed, but if steam did not become dominant, could surely have been worked or developed. So sailing ships need masts, steamships need big tall funnels. Why not combine the two? So a funnel as a mast? Now, there's one big problem with that. Funnels get really hot. So, I mean, and also funnels tend to be casings. I mean, they're relatively strong, but really what a funnel needs to be is a casing that will stand up to wind and wave pressure and trunk the exhaust gases high above the ship. They don't necessarily have to have the same kind of strength that a mast does, certainly once you mount sails on it. So yeah, you're going to face two problems. One is your big tall funnel is going to need to be incredibly strong, much more heavily built, I think, than most funnels, certainly of the 19th century. And you're going to have to solve the problem, how do you get men up to your sails, and how do you keep your sails from catching fire when you have a lot of very hot exhaust gases running through your funnel? So not only being very heavily built, you may also have to very heavily insulate them. Which, yeah, that could be interesting. Mark Bass saying, modern sailing super yachts use masters funnels. Fair. But I'm also going to hazard a guess that most modern sailing super yachts don't have, several tens of thousands of horsepower of coal oil-fired boilers trying to funnel their exhaust gases up through them. Mar Hawkman saying, yeah, funnels aren't mounted to the ship's frame like masts are. This is also true. But they could be stepped like masts. Masts have to bear a huge amount of load. Megascrow saying, this is meant as a normal Drydock question as it's more technical. Okay, yeah, that's fair. Maybe I should have included it in the main Drydock recording, but I think when I was listing these questions out, I saw it as hybrid technologies that may or may not have existed if steam didn't become dominant. So that kind of immediately went, oh, alternate history, off it goes into there. So I do apologise if you feel the question has been misplaced, but that's why it's ended up where it is. And Dr. Clark pointing out, yes, the top way such master funnels, because of the thing, funnel has to be pretty big. Once you've made it thick enough, possibly insulated to take the loads, insulated enough so you don't, cook the men who are trying to climb up. Yeah, I don't think it's practical for steamships. Lou Sir asks, toroidal prop efficiency, is it really 105% increase? Chazix, what month's question are you answering? So this is the Drydock, this is episode 241, so this is, well, we're in April, so this was March's, this is the one that goes with March. There'll be one in a couple of weeks, which will be April's, which will be the Patreon Drydock that's coming out this weekend, hopefully. And Floppy's gone to hide completely behind a table, so you won't be able to see him at the moment unless he decides to get up and move. Anyway, so the toroidal propeller thing. I don't know necessarily about 105% efficiency, but toroidal propellers are more efficient if somewhat higher demand for, in terms of, actual manufacturing costs. I'd like to see some done full scale. There are companies that already sell toroidal propellers that are full scale ones, although if I remember correctly, they use them on outboard motors, not on full scale ships, if you like. But there is a definite efficiency improvement from them. I wouldn't put money on saying it's 105%, certainly, but it'd be interesting to see what goes on. One of the big problems with toroidal propellers is because they are a much more complex shape. As I said, they have to be manufactured with much tighter tolerances, which means that when you see people doing videos like, oh look, I quickly 3D printed this toroidal propeller on my FDM 3D printer, and now I'm going to stick it on my drone or on my boat and see whether it's quieter or more efficient or whatever, and it turns out to not really be working very well. I'm kind of looking at it and going, well, yes, but that's also because your toroidal propeller looks like it was carved out of a chunk of wood by a 3-year-old. You'd have to get a very, very finely crafted toroidal propeller using, and have to print it using the 3D resin printer and get the pitch and everything and the twist very correct. Otherwise, it isn't going to work very well. Whereas regular propellers are much, much easier to do. Mrs. Drack pointing out that the roast beef that I was preparing earlier today has apparently come out of the oven now. Yeah, Sean pointed out toroidal propellers for PCs and didn't work for that application. Yes, I can imagine they wouldn't, because if you think of a PC fan, that's lots and lots of smaller blades. Toroidal propellers are designed for, yeah, don't try and cool your PC with a toroidal propeller. Dr. Clark pointing out that when we're at Farnborough for the Defence Leaders Conference later, I think that's next month, we will see someone demonstrating a toroidal propeller, so I'll be able to report back a bit more for that. Alex the Mayor says, can you share some? I wish. I mean, the only reason I'm cooking a massive joint of roast beef today when I have a live stream is because my entire fridge freezer unit died over the weekend and we had to do an emergency replacement. But the roast beef was one of the things that was, yeah, that it had defrosted completely, so it needed to be cooked. I apologise, Megascrow. I will award you an additional question in this, in the current, which I think is the May Patreon poll. So Megascrow gets 2 questions. Obviously not this coming weekend because I'm already partway through recording that, but for the end of May, you get an extra question as by way of an apology. Now the entire chat wants roast beef. Mike Lima 777 asks, if the Admirals, that's the Admiral class battle cruisers and therefore Hood, had been designed from the start with all or nothing armour, would this have affected the decision to cancel all but Hood by 1918, and how might this have impacted the Washington Naval Treaty? Would the change in the armour scheme have made a difference at Denmark Strait? If they'd been designed with all or nothing armour, I'm not sure, to be honest. The thing is, the Admiral design predates Jutland. They did their best to update Hood for some of the lessons learned at Jutland, but, you know, there's a lot of space to protect on Hood, and I think if you're trying to do full all or nothing to cover the volume and surface area that you need to protect on Hood, our magazines, our engineering spaces, etc., you may have either ended up having to compromise on the thickness of the armour, or you may have ended up having to compromise on the speed as the thing gets heavier, or a little bit of both. Or you could just have a smaller citadel. I guess that's also possible. But if it reflects all or nothing armour with a few other changes, they might have chosen to keep going with them at that stage. How that would have impacted the Washington Naval Treaty, well, I've discussed that in a few other previous Drydock questions. You know, if there's multiple Hoods out there, then given that the US Navy's own rating put Hood at approximately the same level as a Colorado class, you're probably looking at The US Navy certainly would be arguing to complete all of their Colorados, so all 4 Colorados. The Japanese, given that they aren't planning on building more than 2 Nagatos, would probably be arguing literally to complete a Tosa. And it would be hard to argue otherwise, and the Royal Navy would be in a bit of an interesting position of, if you've got 4 Colorado equivalents, the Americans are building 4 Colorados, how are they going to justify building the Nelsons? They're probably not going to be able to. People pointing out, apparently there's an echo. Okay, has that solved things? I hope XSplit hasn't decided to suddenly re-enable the Streamcam's camera. No, it hasn't. Is the echo solved now? Okay, is that better? Oopsie. Okay, this is weird. There's not 2 microphones attached. I was literally doing nothing. It sounds like there's an additional microphone source. Hang on, let me go into my... Why would that just randomly come on? Oh, for flip's sake. Okay, how's that? Is that any better now? Right, yes, for some bizarre reason, Microsoft Windows decided it was just going to... I don't know what the heck it was doing. It just decided it was suddenly going to accept the camera as also an input. Flipping sec. Today is not a good day for technology, is it? Right. Where was I? Let me just refresh that. Right, okay. Let's get back to questions. Anyway, so yeah, Hood with an all or nothing. Would the change in armor scheme have made a difference at Denmark Strait? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, it depends what happens with the armor. Does it extend deeper as a result of being all or nothing? Or is it extending higher? Is it not covering as large an area? How is it affecting the hydrodynamics of the ship? So yeah, there's a possibility that an all or nothing Hood might have made a big difference at Denmark Strait, but also possibly might not have changed anything. Right. Then we have a very long question Okay, so that's the long one I'll come back to at the end. 22NF2 asks the hypothetical situation of the French fleet escaping the British at Mers el Kebir, but is ultimately intercepted off the coast of Spain. What would a World War II era Trafalgar look like? What would the order of battle be, and what is the most likely outcome? So you have a little bit of a problem in that the Dunkirk and Strasbourg notionally only Hood can catch, but as actually was proven at the historical Mers el Kebir, Hood's machinery was in such a terrible state that she stripped a turbine trying to chase down Strasbourg. Everything else that the British have present can't catch Dunkirk and Strasbourg, and it turns out Hood can't either. Conversely, poor old Britannia, the old French battleship that's at Mers el Kebir, as well as a few other French ships, are slow enough that you will end up with them being chased down and caught by the entire British fleet. So ultimately, I mean, the only way that Dunkirk and Strasbourg are going to get caught and intercepted is if they stick with the slowest elements of the French fleet from Mers el Kebir. And the minute it develops into a battle, which they may lose, considering that Ark Royal is going to be there lofting swordfish at them as well, then the French can just go, okay, we will sacrifice Britannia, and while you're shooting at that, almost shades of Dogger Bank, Dunkirk and Strasbourg make a beeline for the escape route. At which point it comes down to, can the swordfish from Ark Royal cripple one or both of them enough to slow them down such that the British can overhaul them later on? If they can, then it'll basically be a long strung out series of picking on one ship at a time, and if they can't, or even if they can slow them down but they can't slow them down enough, then the French ships will escape. It said chat disconnected and reconnected. I don't know what's going on. No, I don't know what's... Yeah, the chat, it says chat disconnected. I don't know what's going on today. It's a bit weird. Anyway, since everyone seems to be able to hear me, we shall recommence if everyone can hear me. Okay, great, that's fine. Everyone can see and hear me. The chat just seems to randomly come and go. It's fun today, isn't it? Let's just double check something. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to see if there's anything I can do to fix this. Okay, chat's working again. Right. Okay, this is just bizarre. Right, anyway, let's get back to questions once more. Randwick78, what do you what do you think the effects of Admiral Lee and Admiral Cunningham being hand-waved into the posts held by the other held throughout the war? What areas of command and specific insights might they have done better or worse than the other historically? Do you think Admiral Lee could have handled the French in Alexandria as well as Cunningham, and can you see him handling the battle off of Greece, i.e. Matapan, differently? What sort of first Sea Lord do you think Admiral Lee would have made? On the other hand, do you think Cunningham would have been likely to make as effective use of radar and have Washington's gunnery at a similar standard at the Guadalcanal campaign? Would he have a chance to influence how the Americans approached night fighting, etc., etc.? Okay, so looking at Cunningham at Guadalcanal. So by the time that Guadalcanal is fought, Admiral Cunningham has either tried to or successfully led a number of nighttime gunnery actions using radar, including Matapan. So whereas for the Americans, with Washington using radar to guide herself in at night at Guadalcanal was a fairly new experimental way of doing things, for Admiral Cunningham it would have been fairly old hat. Now, whilst Admiral Cunningham was insistent on having really good gunnery on his ships, he is not himself personally the level of gunnery expert that Admiral Lee is, but he would still have his ships in pretty good fighting condition. So I think overall the Battle of Guadalcanal is unlikely to go all that much different once it comes down to, can Cunningham get close enough to the Japanese to kill them all? Yes, he can. The earlier stages where the destroyers are lost and where South Dakota wanders off, those might go slightly better for the Americans, because with more experience of how to actually fight a night action, Cunningham might change his formations and his radio discipline a little bit more to keep them in more of a Matapan style formation. Now, in terms of everything else, would he have influenced the way the Americans approach night fighting? Well, yes, as I say, by 1942, Admiral Cunningham is a seasoned veteran of night actions with radar, so he'd be able to effectively just turn around and say, okay, here's the Royal Navy playbook, we're doing this now. In terms of Admiral Lee, during his career, I don't know if Admiral Lee was ever forced into major international diplomatic situations, but then again, he managed to get along with most of the admirals he served under or served with fairly well. So, he's obviously not going to have quite the same level of knowledge of dealing with the French personally that Admiral Cunningham has, and which Admiral Cunningham was able to exploit at Alexandria. But I don't think Admiral Lee would do too much worse. I mean, he seems like a fairly reasonable person. He seems to get on with people, so he'd probably be able to talk the French admiral into doing something relatively reasonable. It would just be that personal connection and knowledge that would be a little bit of an issue. Then, in terms of Admiral Lee at Matapan, I think if Admiral Lee was given the chance to get up to spec with Royal Navy radar, he'd do as well or better than Cunningham with the actual battle itself, whereas the main thing would be it's happening a couple of years early, so he'd need to study really, really quickly. But I'm pretty sure he can do just as well at Matapan. 2 seconds. Right, so Mrs. Drack has dropped off my dinner, so I apologise, but I will have to eat this because I haven't had anything all day. That genuinely has come out pretty well. So I'll be snacking while I continue. Admiral Waite asks, Drac has been asked to name 8 Type 83 destroyers for 8 20th century British admirals. What names would you choose and why? Oh, 8 admirals now, that's asking. I mean, obviously, Cunningham, Somerville, Vian, Jellicoe. That's 4 easy ones. I really don't want to name one after Beatty. Bruce Fraser, I mean, he took Duke of York to kill Scharnhorst, so he should probably get one. I'd personally like to name one after Sturdy, and he did win the Battle of Falkland Islands, so I guess there's justification for that. Then you've got 2 more. I mean, you could go back with Hood, but I don't think the Royal Navy will go with Hood just yet. So yeah, I don't think that one's going to work. Who else can we have? I mean, yeah, Fisher, technically. Fisher is just about a 20th century admiral. And I suppose if you're casting that across the entire 20th century, the other one you can do as well as Fisher would be to go with, and the name's now gone completely from my head. I want to say Woodward, that's it. Yeah, Admiral Woodward from the Falkland Islands. So that would be a decent choice of 8, I think. Okay, so I'm just trying to get some food down me. Tyler Dunn asks, during the Washington Naval Treaty, all existing capital ships post-Dreadnought are allowed to be retained. What happens to the ships? And which ones are modernised or scrapped and replaced? Yes, Cunningham was the first one. Churchill was never an admiral. So if everyone is allowed to retain all existing capital ships post-Dreadnought, theoretically that means that their tonnage allowance is going to be... Yeah, that's interesting. It means the tonnage allowance is going to be quite large, but, I mean... Okay, looking at the Royal Navy, because they're the ones with the most capital ships, I think all the 12-inch ships are definitely going to the scrapyard. Immediately, pretty much. 12-inch battle cruisers, 12-inch battleships. They're not viable anymore. They might try and keep more of the 13.5-inch ships around for a while, but with that amount of tonnage left over, they're going to be able to build, well, assuming the treaty allows them to build, they're going to want to build up a bunch more ships. But I could see maybe keeping Lion and Princess Royal around in addition to Tiger for a while until they can build new battle cruisers. Historically, they kept the Iron Dukes around for a bit. I mean, the King George V's even stayed around for a little while until Nelson and Rodney came online. So the Orions, I mean, it depends what everyone else is keeping, because the next largest fleet, the US fleet, has fewer big, their 14-inch fleet is not the equivalent of the Royal Navy's 15 and 13.5-inch fleet, which is why you get things like Arkansas still in active service by World War II. So I think if the US tries to say scrap the South Carolinas and keep everything else in service, the British might hold on to the Orions for a while. But if the Americans are likewise going, well, let's scrap everything that's not 14-inch or larger and use all this extra tonnage we've therefore been given to build some new stuff, then the British will probably go with roughly historically, maybe keep the Iron Dukes around for a bit until they can get more heavier ships in. The Japanese are in a bit of a hard place because if the British and the Americans are doing that, the Japanese don't have that many dreadnoughts anyway, or even semi-dreadnoughts. They're going to want to retain as many as they can, but they're going to face the same obsolescence issues. So, assuming that they're allowed to keep all the capital ships, I think you're probably going to see roughly close to historical scrappage rates anyway, maybe even harsher. Because perhaps to fund the next wave of 16-inch armed ships, they may very well the Royal Navy may kick everything 12 and 13.5-inch, bar maybe the battle cruisers, straight to the curb. The US Navy might get rid of all of its 12-inch ships and just settle on starting with Texas and New York, which would be a slightly smaller fleet to start with, but freeing up more tonnage for bigger ships to be built in the 1920s. Sean asking what kind of lizard is in the picture behind you. That's my leopard. Well, our leopard gecko Geeky. That's a painting, a commissioned drawing we had done in memorial because she passed away a few years ago. Night6831 asking why would the Royal Navy not want to use HMS Hood again, as it's been over 80 years since she sank. I think because it's such a catastrophic disaster that's until very recently been in living memory. I think it'll probably be at least another 20 years before they'll be happy with reusing Hood. And 6831 pointing out, the 13.5-inch ships, I think they'll stay around if other people are keeping large numbers of ships around. If other people are using the opportunity with the tonnage and the scrap value to go, actually, we're just going to replace huge numbers of ships with fewer big ships, then the Royal Navy will probably do the same thing and standardise on a 15 and 16-inch fleet. October Nid asks, what are your favourite ideas you could see playing out in terms of naval design if the political map was laid out differently? Things like Italy owning Gibraltar, or Britain sharing the crown of Prussia, or a neo-Nordic empire instead of German unification. Well, a neo-Nordic empire is probably going to be a lot more close-minded is not necessarily the right word, but they're going to be focused a lot more on closer in issues. And a neo-Nordic empire will probably have a very large Baltic fleet to see off the Russians. Britain also having the crown of Prussia probably is not going to change all that much. I mean, they're going to need a land-based army in Europe, but that's kind of what Prussia is for. So I don't think that's going to change matters all that much. 9683 on saying, did the previous question apply to cruisers? I don't think so, because I think it mentioned dreadnoughts specifically. So yeah, Britain sharing the crown of Prussia is probably not going to change all that much. Italy owning Gibraltar, now that might change things, because if Italy owns Gibraltar, the Royal Navy has much less access to much less guaranteed access to the Mediterranean. If Italy's on side, they've got access, but if Italy's not on side, they're going to have issues. whereas Italy now has an outpost that's very important but also very far away, so Italy's ships might start focusing on longer range Atlantic operations rather than short range Mediterranean and later Red Sea operations. And Britain, well, it's going to be interesting because if Britain still has, along with France, control of the Suez Canal, then they've got one way into the Mediterranean. The Ottomans have another way, it will be only if you're coming from the Black Sea, and Italy has the third, which means assuming that Britain doesn't try and ally with Italy, the entire Mediterranean theatre is going to be very much more competitive. Brad Cochran says, are you going to do a video on Thomas Cochrane, and if so, when? Yes, probably next year. Mark Maher, talking about Hood being lost, they reused Prince of Wales. They did, but Prince of Wales, as some people pointing out in the chat, didn't take almost all of her crew with her. It wasn't quite as catastrophic a level of destruction. George H. asks, alternative for the Battle of Leyte Gulf. If Centre Force... wow, that's... Okay, I'm going to adjust that. If Centre Force changes place with the Southern Force, and in a potentially catastrophic mix-up of American intel and recon, Kurita's force is comprised of Yamato, Musashi, etc., steam up in the middle of the night encountering the 7th Fleet, would the radar-controlled 16 and 14-inch guns with advanced fire control of West Virginia, California, and Tennessee, as well as the less advanced fire control of the others, be able to hold off Yamato, Musashi, and their consorts? Okay, so basically it's a revised Battle of Surigao Strait. I'm not sure, to be honest, because the US Navy managed to create an absolute cauldron of fire which took down the historical Southern Force. But the historical Southern Force was much smaller and much less capable than this new one. Because, of course, you've also got Nagato, you've got the 2 surviving Congos, and if Musashi has also survived, so you've got 5 capital ships. Now, okay, the survival odds of Nagato and the 2 Congos are not much better than those of Fuso and Issei, except for the fact they're a little bit quicker, so they might be slightly harder to hit. But we all know how much of a pounding both Musashi and Yamato took to actually sink. Now, granted, that's with aerial torpedoes, the Mark 13s. They're not quite as punchy as the Mark 15s that'll be on the various US destroyers, and Yamato and Musashi will get worked over a fair bit. But you've also got a reasonable number of cruisers present. Japanese cruisers, they have torpedoes and guns and searchlights, and a fair number of Japanese destroyers present, again, torpedoes and guns and searchlights. So if Kurita basically forms up a mailed fist and tries to punch through with his destroyers backed up by his cruisers, backed up by the Congos, and then with Yamato, Musashi, and Nagato coming in closely but at the rear, I think it's possible he might be able to force Yamato and Musashi and Nagato into a close enough range firefight that, although the fire control systems of the US ships and their radar is going to give them something of an advantage, they'll be close enough that flares and fires and just visual sightings will allow the Japanese to fire back with considerable effect as well. So would the Japanese fleet be able to effect a breakthrough? I don't know. Possibly not. But it's going to cost the US an awful lot to stop Kurita at that point, because it's basically going to end up being a knife fight in the dark, where one side's got a flashlight and the other's got the equivalent of infrared vision. Sapper Ninja says, I have I have this undying hope that the Royal Navy will call the Type 83 the Admiral class, as this is similar to the previous one. If my hopes and dreams were made to come true, I would like to see Hood, Nelson, Rodney, Cunningham, Vian, Tarvey, and Jellicoe, maybe Iron Duke for fun. But what admirals or other military eras do you believe would be deserving of being honoured in this way? So this is very similar to the previous question, except it's opening it up to a much wider audience of admirals. St. Vincent would definitely be one I'd put up there. Hawke, Admiral Hawke as well. From that, they'll be from history. Blake, going further back, would be a good one. Drake as well. You might as well stick him in. I mean, it depends how many Type 83s we're building at that point. But yeah, I mean, between those and the ones that have been listed, that's probably far more Type 83s than the Royal Navy's ever going to build. Swe420 Den asks, well, it's pretty much the Nevada question again. If she sinks in the channel, so Breach already answered that with the previous question. And then what happens if Japan continues to attack the ship in harbour to make her salvage more difficult? Well, then her salvage becomes more difficult, but hitting Nevada again and again with the dive bombers isn't really going to affect her salvage all that much. The main thing that would make her salvage more difficult would be if one or two of the Japanese torpedo bombers broke off and put a couple of torpedoes into her, which would make it considerably harder to patch her up enough to get her afloat, which would in turn delay proceedings with people getting in and out of Pearl Harbor. Again, as I said, not much. They'd be able to go around her, but it would make things a lot more inconvenient for considerably longer. Greb asks, name your pick of the most successful designed ship of the major navies in the World War I era and why, or just your favourite of each for whatever reason. Most successfully designed ship? Is that most efficient, I guess, of the major navies in the World War I era? Well, I mean, the Queen Elizabeth class is the obvious pick for the Royal Navy, because they fought as frontline units in, well, at least Queen Elizabeth, Warspite and Valiant did, fought as frontline units in both World War I and World War II, and relatively successfully at that. So those have to be the most successful British designed vessels. In terms of German design, well, the main problem is a lot of them ended up being scuttled, which doesn't help their post-war careers very much. And the few German destroyers, torpedo boats and cruisers that ended up in other people's hands were mainly there because they were useful, not because they were particularly fantastic designs. I mean, the Der Flingers are pretty solid ships. They're fairly well designed. Gregory Wright pointing out no torpedo bombers in Pearl Harbor's second wave. Yes, true. It's more about, if the torpedo bombers went after Nevada at all. Now, American most successful design ship from World War I era. See, that's a little bit harder because all the standards pretty much went on to secondary duties for the most part. They didn't really build any cruisers. Even the Clemson Wick Swarm is kind of as much a post-war thing as it is a wartime thing. So, I mean, most successful design ship of the US Navy in World War I probably has to be Texas, by dint of the fact she's managed to survive. And I mean, well, for the Japanese, much as I would maintain that the Congos remained battle cruisers, they were, relatively speaking, for the situations they were put into in World War II, successful, and they were pretty good. They were pretty decent battle cruiser designs for the First World War as well. The fact that they were on a completely losing one-sided engagement for most of World War II is not really their problem. It's the people who ended up putting them into those situations. So just eating there. Gregory Wright says Nevada sorties between first and second waves. Yeah, I'm talking about basically if the Japanese had hit her harder in the first wave and then decided to chase up on that. Say the dive bombing is not really going to change much, but if she had some extra torpedo holes in her, and then the dive bombers sort of opened up a few extra seams, which is then theoretically why she might sink in the channel and not be able to beach herself. That's kind of the situation I was getting at. Michael Gilson that says, I'm sure you're familiar with the joke that starts, in heaven the police are British, the chefs are French, etc., etc. How would the World War II Navy version of that joke go with the Royal Navy, the US Navy, the Japanese, the Italians, and the Germans? Something like, in World War II Navy heaven, the light anti-aircraft is Royal Navy, the torpedoes are Japanese Navy, the damage control is US Navy, etc. In World War II Navy hell, light anti-aircraft is the Japanese Navy, the torpedoes are from the US Navy circa early part of World War II. The night fighting is done by the Italians. And then what we've got, the Germans and the Royal Navy. The Design Efficiency Bureau is German, and the carrier air wings are Royal Navy. John McDonough asks, in the previous Drydock question, I asked about Enterprise in North Carolina, Eastern Solomons, and the problem of do you stick with the slower ship for protection or get up to full speed for your maneuverability? My answer said, well, if you put North Carolina in front of Enterprise, then you would slowly overtake her, but staying her coverage for a while. But in the actual Guadalcanal campaign, North Carolina was 1.5 miles behind Enterprise. So in an hour of steaming at 30 to 33 knots, Enterprise could be 4.5 to 7.5 miles away, which is outside of possibly even long-range anti-aircraft cover. Does this change your answer in any way? Well, I suppose... yeah, if you're going to leave your heavy protection behind, this is a bit of a problem. I think the one of the things, though, would be to take into account would be exactly how far ahead you get. I don't think you'd want to get too far ahead. If you were 10 nautical miles away, you'd have some serious problems. There's at that point, why even have the battleship there? But the other thing I could see would be that when you're doing evasive maneuvers, you're not going to be going in a straight line. So that would allow the slower ship, the North Carolina in this case, to catch up. But also what I personally would do if I was faced with that situation would be run my strikes, get my airstrikes off, but then just do a U-turn and just double back on myself for a bit. So I'd be closing head on with North Carolina, although obviously offset a bit. And then once I've entered into range of her, then I double back again. So I'd basically be doing run forward, quick double back to get back in AA range, then run forward again. And I'd be conducting my air ops, obviously, while I'm on my straightforward run. And then he also says, the scuttling of the Danish fleet. I've seen some sources that said the Germans found the loss of the minesweepers to be a serious blow that already stretched resources. Now, Danish minesweepers weren't going to win the war for Germany, but I think there's more of an impact than your answer may have indicated. So this is before when I said the loss of the Danish fleet didn't really change all that much for the Kriegsmarine. And I think... this is the thing. The loss of the Danish minesweepers was annoying, but the Germans can't possibly have planned the Kriegsmarine around, well, when we acquire the Danish minesweeping fleet. So, whilst in the event with the number of mines they ended up having to deal with, not having the Danish minesweepers on hand was not good for the Kriegsmarine. I think that's more in terms of what could have been effects rather than other things. YouTube is now telling me now would be a good time to insert ads. Okay, hands up everybody who wants to see an ad play right now. No one? Good. Right, thanks. I can hit close and hopefully that'll go away for a bit. Anyway. Right, so yeah. I think it's more of a... Well, it would have been really nice to have those, but the Kriegsmarine was stretched. The Kriegsmarine was stretched in pretty much every direction, so any kind of ships it could have got its hands on from the Danish fleet would have helped. But it's also a kind of, well, yes, in theory it would help, but in practice it's not really going to change all that much. Yeah, don't worry, I'm being sarcastic. We're not putting ads on a stream. I value my life, and considering that I semi-regularly tell you guys where I'm going on various overseas trips, saying to everyone, yes, of course, I'm going to randomly stick an ad on my live stream, and then saying, hey guys, you can come and meet me at this location. I'm not that dumb. John Edward Dietz asks, in the Battle of Britain, the RAF seemed to do most of the heavy lifting, but was it ever conceived to have the Royal Navy position a few cruiser squadrons in the Channel to help break up Luftwaffe attacks before they made landfall? So it wasn't really thought of because the Royal Navy had a lot of other things it needed its cruisers for. And positioning them in the Channel, I mean, yes, in theory they could shoot at German bomber formations, but it would also land them in the sights of every single dive bomber and torpedo bomber in the Luftwaffe arsenal. And positioning a few cruisers to... I mean, yes, they bring a reasonable amount of heavy air firepower to bear, but if you're trying to break up Heinkel 111, Dornier 17, Junkers 88 bomber streams, then you're only really going to be using your long-distance AA, which is going to be your 4-inch guns. And with the best will in the world, even once they've doubled up on them, 8, or in the case of Belfast or Edinburgh, 12 4-inch guns compared to the risks of putting some of your precious cruisers at risk, it's not worth it. And I don't think the Admiralty I think the Admiralty basically didn't consider it for exactly those reasons. And as we've discussed via Patreon, there's a couple of other questions you've asked over the past, which I will be including in subsequent videos. Grey Ghost saying they did have the flak towers in the River Thames. Well, such as they are, yes, but one of the advantages about those is they're a lot cheaper and they don't sink compared to a cruiser. Jonathan Smith asks, the bulbous bow. Do you happen to know if anyone ever built or refitted a ship to test a variable geometry bulbous bow, something that could change size or shape or to switch between 2 or more states, each of which was optimized for a different speed? I don't know if anyone has ever done that. That sounds like something maybe in the latter part of the 20th century someone might have experimented with. But to be perfectly honest, from an engineering perspective, I really, really wouldn't want to be the one who had to try and do something like that because, I mean, a ship's bow is subject to an awful lot of force. If you're making some kind of variable geometry bulbous bow, particularly if you're optimizing it for different speeds, that's going to have to be different lengths. You're going to need some absolutely colossal hydraulic rams to adjust it mid-flow, considering the amount of force that's going to be exerted on it, without either slamming back into the ship or just breaking the extension systems. plus all your watertight seals are going to have to be up to the same spec, which is going to be interesting to say the least. And if anything at any point goes wrong and the whole thing collapses in on itself, you have a massive breach in your bow, which is now rushing through the water at 20 plus knots probably. So, yeah, as far as I know, and so people who know more about modern shipping, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, nobody tried a variable geometry bulbous bow on any kind of substantial ship. And if they did, it would probably end disastrously badly. Warren Jervy asks, if the Russian Revolution commences in December 1916, leading to the abdication of the Tsar by the year's end and the establishment of a new government that immediately commences negotiations to unconditionally leave the war and cede all lost territory to the Central Powers. Alarmed by these developments, the British, French, Italians and their allies quickly asked for a separate armistice. Resulting diplomacy freezes territorial gains and losses as they stood at the end of 1916, with the exception of Germany withdrawing from northern France and Germany's colonies being restored to her. All sides expect the armistice to last up to maybe 20 years. Assuming the Central Powers and the Allies maintain the same membership as they existed at the end of 1916, but assuming Russia is now neutral, what are your predictions as to how each side will restructure or increase their navies in anticipation of the next war? And what do you predict would be the major strategies of each navy? Right, well, somehow this means the Austro-Hungarians and Ottomans presumably are surviving because everything is being frozen. Dr. Clark put a link in there saying apparently the Norwegians have recently ruled out a variable geometry bulbous bow. So, there we go. I mean, Germany's on a bit of a hiding to nothing in this case because historically, obviously, the Germans had the Italians on side, so the Regia Marina was able to perform some distraction duties. This time they've got the Austro-Hungarians somehow still on side, but the Austro-Hungarians are going to be facing their own issues. Whereas the Allies, I mean, let's face it, with all the best will in the world, the Russian Navy, or the Soviet Navy, I guess, by that point, in World War II, wasn't exactly a major mover and shaker on the high seas for much of the war. So, and the French obviously bowed out a little bit early, but if you think about, you know, the Regia Marina and the Marine Nationale and the Royal Navy all working together, and the Germans have the Kriegsmarine and I guess the Austro-Hungarians occupying some of the Italian attention. That's, I mean, I think navally, obviously, if Germany's, if the war ends in an armistice or negotiated peace, Germany can retain the high seas fleet. But given that she's got a bunch of extra land to look after, and you've now got quite a, you know, the Italians have officially switched sides. I think if the Germans are sensible, they'll restructure their fleet around a colonial fleet with a battle force that's capable of taking on the French or the Italians, possibly with, you know, going to help the Austro-Hungarians. But Germany doesn't have the money to build the army that they're going to need to hold off the continental portion of the Allies, whilst also building a navy to hold off the British alone, let alone everybody else. And you see that before the war. You know, that's why part of the reason why the German battleship building effort tails off quite significantly from 1912 onwards, because the army needs funding. Now the army needs even more funding because they've got to worry about the Italians, whereas before the Italians were their allies. So, and even then, the Germans couldn't quite match British naval output. So, at that stage, it doesn't serve anything to antagonise the British by building a fleet they're never going to get close enough to in size. So, I think the high seas fleet will probably end up being scaled down quite a bit. The Italians would probably have an ahistorically larger navy because they've got to consistently still worry about the Austro-Hungarians. And as far as the French go, I think it's going to be a case of how seriously do they take the Germans as a threat on land. So the French fleet, the Marine Nationale might end up being slightly smaller, but the Eurasian Marine will end up being slightly larger. Patrick Donnelly asks, we're almost done with the alternate history questions, by the way. That's quite surprising. Patrick Donnelly asks, had North Carolina not been torpedoed by I-19, would her presence at the Battle of Santa Cruz have been enough to save Hornet? Maybe. I mean, she might have shot down some planes. She might have broken up some attacks. Those attacks might have gone after her. She might have been powerful enough to take Hornet in tow. So I wouldn't say it guarantees enough to save Hornet. She might be out of position and not able to help Hornet at all, and it might pretty much just go as historical. But there would be a higher chance of Hornet surviving with North Carolina being present than not. Coneled asks, if for some reason Nimitz allowed Gormley to remain in command of the Guadalcanal campaign instead of replacing him with Halsey, how different do you think the campaign would have turned out? Probably quite badly, because Gormley's leadership was lacking. And, I mean, he was relieved for a reason. Nimitz basically considered that his nerve had broken. So excuse me, choked on air. That was annoying. Choking on air is awful. Anyway, how would the campaign have turned out? As I say, probably somewhat worse. I mean, the individual sub-commanders like Scott and Lee would have still done a pretty decent job, but the overall tactics and strategy, especially with the how the carriers are used with Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, is probably not going to be quite as good as it was historically. As I've said before with Halsey, Halsey was the perfect person to be put in that position in 1942 when the US Navy really needed to organise around someone who was very aggressive. HMS Verdun, I have mentioned, I think I mentioned ship shape. No, I haven't on this live stream. Not yet. I will mention ship shape once we get done with the alternate history equations. There's this one, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 8 left, including this one. So yeah, I mean, there's not a huge amount, apart from maybe completely screwing up his supply lines, that Gormley can do to lose the land campaign to the Japanese. But it could certainly come at a much higher price for the US Navy. Vicky pointing out Halsey's recklessness threw away Hornet and got a big chunk of the US Navy's cruiser force killed. I'm not so sure about that. When the Japanese fleet came to play at Eastern Solomons and then at Santa Cruz, the US Navy pretty much had to engage them. And the failures that led to Hornet being sunk are more to do with doctrinal and operational issues within the US Navy, like how good or not their fighter control and fighter direction was, and sending the cruisers in theory could have gone a lot better. If Admiral Callahan and Admiral Wright had been not there, and you'd had Admiral Scott or anyone with a degree of common sense leading them, it could have gone significantly better. Halsey wasn't physically present for those battles, so the US Navy not only needed someone quite aggressive for them to rally around, they also needed quite a bit of, what's the best way of putting it? They needed quite a bit of attrition to get rid of some of the officers who, what shall we say, weren't really up to the task of command. Derp Squad. No, that was Floppy. He occasionally grumbles and mumbles to himself in his sleep. He may only be 12 weeks old, but deerhounds are born as grumpy old men, and they stay that way. So Marlin Stout asks, suppose the Atlanta class was armoured to resist 8-inch shells, but kept the same weapons and sensor fit and speed. How much bigger or heavier would it need to be to have better stability, and would it be effective in fighting other cruisers, given the rate of fire of the 5-inch gun? 8-inch shells, so you're talking Wichita, Baltimore levels of armour, maybe a bit more. In fact, it would have to be more, because Wichita and Baltimore are designed to fight with their own 8-inch guns. So if you're fighting with 5-inch 38s, you're going to have to be closer, which means if you're going to resist 8-inch shells, you're going to need even more armour. Wow, that's going to be some cruiser. I mean, you're talking about probably, I would say, a hull, if you're going to fight a 5-inch 38 range, a hull in the 13 to 15,000 ton range. Now, if you've stuck an Atlanta class's armament on it, you've got a really weird ship. Would it be effective at fighting other cruisers and being an effective cruiser killer? At night, maybe. As a night predator, sneaking into relatively close range and then unloading with loads and loads of 5-inch shells, it could be somewhat effective. As a daytime cruiser killer, though, no. Because even if it's armoured to resist 8-inch shells, the simple fact is an 8-inch cruiser can just pelt it at long range and, break the fire control, break the bridge, break the secondary armour, break the 5-inch 38 mounts itself, basically render the ship incapable of fighting, even if the armour is keeping the shells out of the citadel. So, yeah, an Atlanta class expanded to be 8-inch proof would be fine for killing destroyers and cruisers at night where it can sneak up on them with radar, but it would probably be one of the least effective daytime combatants. Jim Smitty says, in the past you've spoken of a possible Wednesday special on the Battle of the Yalu River of the First Sino-Japanese War. However, you said that the sources you've read haven't matched up with each other, which is what's throwing the planning into a mess. I'm wondering, has there been any progress on this video with your various trips and finding new sources, or is it so confusing that you decided to tackle the topic and others from the First Sino-Japanese War, first seeking out an expert on the subject and then performing an interview? So, specifically with Yalu River, there has been a little bit of a breakthrough in as much as I've managed to locate some books, both written in Chinese and written in Japanese, which don't seem to have translations in English, which talk about the Battle of Yalu River. Now, I'm pretty sure they'll give completely different versions of what's going on, but it's probably be slightly more reliable than what we've got at the moment. And I've managed to line up people who can read those languages, who can translate them. The main problem now is actually getting hold of those books, because they seem to be published entirely in Southeast Asia, and the first couple of attempts we've made to getting them shipped over here have ended in disastrous failure. Like, we buy them, we pay for the shipping, they get shipped, and then they get stopped at some airport somewhere and sent back to the retailers for reasons we still haven't managed to figure out. They've never left the Southeast Asian hemisphere, which is weird, but there you go. But yeah, first Sino-Japanese War Battle of Yalu River video will be coming eventually. Matt Osborne says, you are assigned the job of putting a 6-year-old to bed. No books. What seafaring bedtime stories do you tell them? I would probably sing them the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, because it's so horrific but also so horrifically convoluted that their little brain would overload trying to figure out what on earth I was going on about, followed promptly by weird nightmares about albatrosses. But I quite like the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, actually, myself, so that would probably be my go-to. I could probably tell a half-decent version of Treasure Island without referencing a book. Al Sadia said, did you at least get a refund? Yes. Yes, I did. So yeah, I'd have to go if it's seafaring bedtime stories. If it's fictional ones, I'd have to go for Rime of the Ancient Mariner or Treasure Island. If it's historical stuff, I could just go on about, I could tell the story of Quiberon Bay with like actions and prancing around the room and everything. That would be a fun one to tell. Avoid Shisnos asks, Joseph Chamberlain and co. get their wish for a united British Empire. Would this have had a large or noticeable difference on the Royal Navy, funding, construction, etc., or the Anglo-German arms race? I think that's the Imperial Federation we're talking about. Let me have a double check. Yes, okay, that is, yeah. So, yes, if they get the Imperial Federation going, aka the United British Empire, it depends when, because I think that's overall that's probably a subject for a Wednesday video or maybe a fun Friday. But broadly speaking, if they manage to pull off their vision prior to the turn of the 20th century, then by the time they've put more industry in, both general industry and naval industry, etc., into some of the colonies that they're effectively trying to uplift, then that would mean more income, more shipbuilding capability, more money, bigger bases, etc. for the Royal Navy, which would mean the Anglo-German naval arms race would be more like the Anglo-Sphere Empire flexing on the Germans. But if it's post-1900, then a lot of the work that would be necessary to bring those other colonies up to speed in terms of their naval industrial capability would still be going on, and probably actually divert funds away from building up the Royal Navy during the Anglo-German naval arms race. HMS Verdun, if you can drop me a email or Discord message, I will see if I can drop you the details in question of those, of the Japanese books at least. Tall Dude, I just went the questions. Tall Dude says, as a 6'7" male who would want to join the Navy, what direction should I choose? If you're talking about modern day, you basically want carrier duty on the flight deck. Anywhere further deeper in the ship, you're just going to be getting concussion every 5 minutes. If we're going back in the day, in the time travel kind of stuff, you probably want to be a Marine, because they really liked having tall Marines, and you got to spend most of your time up on the upper decks where you weren't going to smack your head on low beams and so forth. BFW says, there is a video from the Australian National Maritime Museum showing HMS Vampire going to action stations. Could you provide a walkthrough? Okay, so that I'm going to have to put into the questions. I think I'm going to have to put that into a question for... Hang on, let me open that. Not that one. Okay, so BFW's question I'm actually going to have to put into this coming week's regular Patreon section, because yeah, I haven't figured out the mysteries of video in video, so I couldn't walk you through this on a live stream. And then Assure Sky asks, or Ski What do you think of the maritime content on, and then provides 2 YouTube channel links? Would you be willing to provide a little exposure for tiny channels covering fascinating historical events? Okay, I can take a look, but I'm not. As I said before, firstly, I don't tend, if I can at all avoid it, I don't tend to say anything negative about another YouTube channel when I haven't already told them in advance and give them a chance to send in a response. So, and obviously I don't know what these channels are like yet, but also, I mean, yeah, as I'll take a look and see if I can see if what they're covering is decent, but that'll take me some time, and I actually need some free time to do that in the first place. So we'll see how that goes. And then Okage has asked, he's the one who has asked the long question again, so I'm just going to quickly read over this and have a quick bite more to eat while I'm figuring out what the brief summary is. So 2 seconds whilst I think about what this question asks. Okay, right. I'm back. So Okage's alternate history question says, with the Sengoku Edo period cross-sections and boat drawings that he sent me previously, you can see the Japanese don't really like ribs on their boats, as Japanese timbers tend to be straight or cut from very straight trees, as there's a huge number of them available in Japan. I guess that also reflects in their ship design at the time, obviously. So if you had an alternate history Dutch-Japanese hybrid shallow draft boat structure without the great availability of curved timbers and much wider planking being possible, what kind of internal structure would be used? I mean, I don't think much wider planking would change the design all that much, because it would just mean fewer individual planks, which is useful and lowers the amount of work needed. So what would they have done? So assuming we've not got that many curved timbers, I suspect what you probably would have seen is kind of, well, I mean, the thing is, we know that the Japanese were capable of building 15th, 16th, 17th century equivalent ships, sort of. The Japanese actually built I think it was a galleon, pretty much to traditional galleon specs, and they also had a number of hybrid type vessels, partly influenced by Japanese design, partly by traditional Japanese design, and then partly by the European designs. Sorry, brain not quite working there. So we can kind of look at those, at which point you would be looking at a mostly traditional Japanese underwater hull shape, but not curving but angled, such that it starts to form more of a distinct bow. And then as you start to get above the waterline, you end up with a ship that looks more and more like a slightly angular version of a galleon or a flute, with, you know, fore and after castles and masts and all of this. So you'd end up with something that's shallower draft than a European vessel of the same size, therefore able to navigate coastal waters and even possibly rivers much better. Slightly less capable of long-distance sea travel because slightly less stable underwater because not as deep a keel, but probably considerably larger overall internal hull volume, therefore more efficient at carrying cargo. Now, would the upper weight structures be similar to Atakebune, with wide, thin cedar and bamboo bundles covering the cannon defences? The rigging and mast type. So the rigging and mast type, from what we see from the actual Japanese hybrid ships, is most likely going to be very similar to European style rigging and sails. I can see them using, especially some of the earlier ships, I can see them actually using maybe a even taller forecastles and stern castles compared to the Europeans, because maybe they'd only have to go up a deck or two using solid built timber, and then whereas a European galleon would have maybe go 2, 3, maybe 4 decks of increasing shortness, all using fairly heavy wooden construction, they might go with 1, maybe 2 heavily built wooden decks, and then 3 or 4 possibly relatively lightweight upper decks, because then they're still fighting platforms, but the lighter weight means there's less effect on stability per platform. Obviously a little bit more of an issue with the wind coming in from the side. So yeah, that's going to be rather interesting. Walter Broad US says RV petrol Drydock update. I haven't heard much from Scotland since the stuff fell over. The petrol fell over in dock, which is a bit unfortunate, but there you go. So that is the extent of the super chats. Sorry, not the super chats, of the my brain is as bad as the technology tonight. That's the extent of the alternate history questions. We're going to move on to the super chats quick in a minute. As Dr. Clark mentioned though, so we do have a confirmed schedule for trip to Australia in June. So for those of you who are in Australia, hello, we're coming your way. Now, it's going to be the Canada crew. So if you've seen either myself or Dr. Clark's videos about our trip to Canada, it's going to be the same crew going down to Australia, hopefully. And the one slight downside of going to Australia is that flights to Australia are expensive. So, you know, we're not exactly being profligate. We're booking decent but fairly basic hotels. We're booking essentially the cheapest flights we can find, but still the cost of me going to Australia, so just myself on my own, the cost for me to get flights and hotels in Australia, not accounting for food and transport, is, put it this way, it's enough that I could take Mrs. Drack with me to my next trip to the States, or my previous trip to the States in February, and we could have gone and splashed out for like 3 or 4 days at Disney World buying whatever we wanted and going on with all the park priorities and everything, and we'd still have money left over compared to what it's going to take for just me to go to Australia. So that's a long way of pointing out that we've decided to set up our crowdfunding platform to try and defray some of those costs. So, you know, if all the costs are met, fantastic, but we're not necessarily expecting everyone to, but we have ShipShape. So that's the organization we've set up. And the reason we set up our own crowdfunding platform instead of going with Kickstarter or Indiegogo, etc., is basically it means that whereas with Kickstarter and Indiegogo, also we do have to set targets, and if the target isn't met, then they just say no, you're not having anything, and so on and so forth. But also they take a fairly big chunk of what you raise, and if people are going to be kind enough to help pay for some travel expenses, we'd rather not give some mysterious third party who has nothing to do with it like a 15% cut. So yeah. Basically, if you want, there's Shipshape. Dr. Clark has just linked it in the chat, so you can go and have a look at that. And of course, for people who help out, there are various rewards at various levels. I will be doing a short video update release, etc., about this, which will be a bit more formal and a bit more scripted later this week. But that's just, for those of you who are wondering what Shipshape is, that's what's happening. And we're now on to Super Chat questions. Right. First Super Chat. Jack Ray says, thank you for your work. Thank you very much, Jack. I'm very happy for you that you are glad. So, David Cameron. He finally gets his question answered. HMS Celandine and its World War II record, and a request for a 5-minute guide on that particular flower class, as my grandfather was brought home by it in 1944. Right, okay. Let me... let me put Celandine into the 5-minute guide rotor. There we go. Celandine is now in my 5-minute guide rotor. Galdir Ioni asks, you are teleported to another world in a fantasy universe. What real-life skill of yours do you abuse to completely break the RPG-themed world you now live in? To quote Spider-Man, given that apparently this is a isekai, some kind of anime thing, to quote Spider-Man, shh, my common sense is tingling. Yeah, I'd be using common sense, or alternatively, if it's an RPG-themed world, I would just horribly exploit my engineering skills to get loads and loads of money because let's face it, most RPG-themed stuff is medieval world or earlier, and there's always these things like, oh, I'll bring electricity. No, you won't. You really won't. If you get teleported back to a medieval or medieval fantasy style world, you're not bringing electricity to that world, even if you understood how to do it, which, let's face it, most people don't. But even if you did understand exactly how to make a generator and how it works and how to control and regulate the voltage and the amperage so you didn't immediately fry the first electrical thing you tried to make, do you know all the necessary smithing and refining and mining skills to make all the materials and so forth? Probably not. I mean, there's probably some people out there who do, but most people don't. So yeah, forget bringing electricity and all that kind of nonsense to things. Just basically allow mega engineering. Things like even things like basic water filtration. How many people got sick of bad quality water back then? As an engineer, I can quite happily throw together a basic water filtration system that will work on 99.9% of everything, and just requires things like sand, gravel, etc., and a small stone tower to put it all in. It's not actually that difficult to do now that we know how it works. So there we go. That would be my RL skill, would be using my engineering powers to build myself a mighty financial empire, and then use money to build an actual empire. I'd let somebody else try and build steam engines. Because, yeah, I know how dangerous they can be if you get it wrong. Gecko Gamer, considering that a lot of ships in the Age of Sail didn't have blueprints, how do you research the technical design of such a ship? Like the type of hull, number of guns and decks, etc. A lot of them have models that survive. This is why ship models are so important. Basically, the 3D not 3D printed, but the 3D ship models, they're usually about this big, give or take. So what's that? About 3 foot plus or minus a bit. Those are the blueprints of the day in the Age of Sail. There are some actual blueprints, some decent paintings and so forth, but realistically, unless you want to go via written accounts, and there's a fair number of written accounts like this ship had so many guns and so many decks and so forth, but if you want to know exactly what the proportions of the ship were and everything, just hunt down the shipbuilder's model, because it is quite literally a scale version of that ship. Vintage Car History saying, I'll handle the steam engines. Yep, you do that, because you know... see, I think I know the basics of steam engines, but being as I am a naval historian, it's like I could tell you chapter and verse how a World War One boiler and vertical triple expansion set, boiler and steam turbine set worked. But I think jumping from civilization that doesn't have steam power to trying to build a vertical triple expansion straight off, that's not going to work. That's going to go horribly, horribly wrong. Something a little bit simpler would be very much welcome. Right. Galdia Yonai asks, the 5th super chat, I have seen an argument that Admiral Callahan actually planned to get into a melee brawl and didn't tell the fleet because it would be a suicide run. Thoughts? That seems unnecessarily harsh on Admiral Callahan. I mean, Callahan's sitting there and going, oh, I know if I get into a melee brawl with the Japanese, I'll probably lose horribly. So I'm not going to tell anyone that we're all going to die and then just sail us out with a bunch of contradictory orders so that we're definitely going to die. I mean, that's moving past incompetence and verging into actual malice. If I've understood the question correctly, I don't think Admiral Callahan was that bad. Yeah, he wasn't Admiral Scott. He probably shouldn't have been in charge. But, he was I think he was giving it his best shot, even if his best shot wasn't particularly good. Whereas, planning to lead your fleet when you know the US Navy is a little bit short on cruisers at that point into their deaths. Yeah, I'm not sold on that one. Sherman117, he's the 6th super chat, says, we all know that World of Warships non-historic refits for historical vessels can be a bit weird, but what in-game refit do you think could have happened if the Navy had the money and time? Well, I mean, a fair number of the ahistoric refits are either because the ships never existed or because the ships were scrapped, well ahead of time. The later German World War One refits, so Baden refit, Mackensen refit, Deflinger refit, etc., they're entirely possible if the German Navy had been allowed to keep them. The refit itself isn't exactly implausible for the most part for those ships if the Germans had been allowed to have those ships after Versailles. And I mean, likewise, a lot of the US refits are based on what the US actually did to things like West Virginia, but just didn't have the money or time to do to some of their other vessels. The British refits are the most interesting ones, to be honest, because exactly when and where and how the British would have done the refits if they'd had the money and time varies quite considerably. So whether you're going to... It's with things like the heavy AA. It's like, would you see twin 4-inch, or would you see twin 4.5-inch, or would you see twin 5.25s? and you could make a relatively convincing argument for all three, depending on exactly what time period you're timing the refit for. Because if it's up to, we're talking about large ships at least, if it's up to sort of the mid 30s, they're probably going to be twin 4s or twin 4.5s. If you're talking about the late 30s, it's maybe into the early 40s, it's going to be twin 5.25s, and then it's going to be twin 4.5s again, but in different mountings from kind of the mid part of the Second World War onwards. CringePog asks, considering the tiny bursting charges and shell mass, could the Akazuki class make up for this by sheer rate of fire, or was this not possible? Well, I mean, they're still 100mm AA shells. The Germans made relatively decent accounting of themselves at sort of medium ranges with 88 mils. So, yes, it's not a 5-inch shell. It's not even a 4 or a 4.5-inch shell, but, you know, it's not hugely terrible. And there is... I know I've said this before, but, you know, the air is a three-dimensional environment that is quite large. So there is something of a diminishing return of investment as the bursting charges and shell masses get higher and higher. Because if you think about how much more an 18-inch shell weighed than, let's say, a 5-inch shell, and then you think of how effective the beehive shells were, which is not particularly, and then you think about how effective a beehive shell, a Type 3 beehive shell's mass in 5-inch shells would have been, there is something to be said for just chucking, you know, a large amount of reasonable sized shells up into the sky and seeing what comes back down again. So, yeah, the sheer rate of fire with the Akazuki's guns probably was a reasonable enough tactic. I mean, certainly it was the best heavy anti-aircraft gun the Japanese had at the time. So, we shall see. But yeah, I think that would work. B1900 pilot. Just okay. Thank you very much. Fleet of Oceans says, I know you give Bern a lot of flack, but I think it's unfair. Surely Bern must be measured as equivalent to other experimental first carriers like Eagle, Hermes, Hosho, etc. Sure, you can do that, but Hermes and Hosho are considerably smaller. Eagle, thing is, if you're going to compare Bern with anything, if you compare them with Hermes and Hosho, they're purpose-built as opposed to conversions, and then you start doing things like number of aircraft per ton, speed, power plant per ton, etc., etc. It gets to be sort of, there's a lot of ratios involved. Eagle is another converted battleship, and so is probably the best thing. If you're going to compare Bern to anything, it's probably Eagle, and Eagle is just better. It's a little bit quicker. It's a fair bit more efficient in its layout. Its engines are superior, and it just gets around and gets things done just that little bit better. So, especially when you consider the basic battleship hulls that both Eagle and Bern were originally based on, Eagle's just a more efficient and better outcome for the convert World War I battleship into carrier. So, as a result, Bern... I think the other reason that Bern does get a fair bit of flack, which possibly isn't quite as much its fault, is that, you know, with Eagle was a second, possibly even a third line ship by World War II and was brought back into sort of frontline service by necessity, because they'd learned from it and had expanded those lessons with Glorious, Courageous, Furious, Ark Royal, and the Illustriouses. Bern was still what passed for a frontline carrier because it was the only carrier that the French had. Then, where were we? That's Ben. Sapper Ninja asks, the annual mud harvest in 1930 has been extremely successful, and Admiral Drake of the Imperial Elbonian Navy has been given limitless funds. Superior diplomacy has given any design from any nation. Okay, so we're picking... Okay, 1930, we're picking the best ship from every nation for our various options. Okay. 1930, ships in service in 1930. Okay, so carrier-wise, in 1930, I'm going to take the Lexingtons. Battleship-wise, for all their turret problems, I'd take the Nelsons. Because my choice for battleships is basically Colorado, Nelson, Nagato. I'm not taking Nagato. I just about edge towards taking the Nelsons. Cruisers. Oh, now there's an issue. There's a fun issue. Because you've got everybody's early attempts at heavy cruisers. So we're definitely not taking the French ones. I mean, the Miyokos are okay. The counties are okay. They've got the upgrade capacity at least. The Northampton, I mean, even the Northamptons, they're not awful. Yeah, the cruiser, well, there's no really light cruisers in 1930, but the heavy cruiser is difficult. There's not any one heavy cruiser that's under construction or in service in 1930 that really stands out and goes, this is the best one, because every single one of them you can point to some fairly significant weaknesses. But there's 3 or 4 where you're sort of going, well, I could take that, maybe not. I mean, if my strategy is to go for a lot of torpedoes, then obviously I'm going to take a Miyoko. If my strategy is more all-round, I might go for a county. If my strategy is mostly gun-based, I might take the latest American product, etc. Yeah, it's a little all over the place. Then destroyers, it's got to be a Fubuki. You have to take a Fubuki because the Fubuki is the sort of the start of the next generation of destroyers. It just is. So that's going to have... I mean, you can improve on the design a bit, but the basic layout and weapons pattern of a Fubuki in 1930 is about as good as you're going to get. Packer 910 asks, given their usefulness in hindsight, would the Japanese have been better served to send the whole battleship fleet to Guadalcanal and fight it out? Not... No, you don't want to take the whole battleship fleet to Guadalcanal. Most of them are too slow. Nagato, Mutsu until it blows itself apart. Yamato and Musashi are the only ones that are fast enough to get in theoretically and actually accomplish something at night without being horribly victimized by American aircraft the next day, which is what's going to happen if you send Fuso, Issei, Yamashiro and Hyuga in. So you don't want to send them in, and sending everyone in at once also isn't really going to work. I think operations by a battleship or battleships definitely would be a better idea than what they did historically. But, and I've said before, Yamato going in would have been a bit of an outside context problem. But, sending in the Fusos and the Isseis would probably just get them killed pointlessly. But some of the other stuff that really didn't do all that much else in the war would the bigger stuff definitely would have helped in Guadalcanal. Gecko Gamer, do you have any book recommendations for the Pacific Theatre for someone who doesn't know an awful lot about naval history? Either Ian Toll's series or James Hornfisher's series. They're pretty good because they cover the Pacific Theatre, and they're in a very accessible writing style. And for the most part, they actually also explain what's going on in a way that you'll understand straight up. Mark Bass asks, if during the American War of Independence the British don't have to deal with France and Spain, what role would HMS Victory specifically have taken, and could she have changed the outcome of the war? If the British don't have to deal with France and Spain, there's no real reason for Victory, if she's even in service at that point, to have anything to do with the American War of Independence. The Continental Navy doesn't have anything that can even really threaten a third rate, let alone a first rate. I mean, yes, okay, they're building one, but that's one. And it's still under construction. So unless the admiral in charge of the seaborne effort really wants a fancy flagship, without France and Spain being involved, there's no real reason for Victory to ever go over to the western side of the Atlantic. It would be frigates at that stage, maybe also the 64s, maybe a handful of third rates. That's all you really need if you're dealing with the Continental Navy. And given that a lot of the American ships, both then and in the War of 1812, are more interested in privateering than they are in straight up naval engagements, you're pretty much looking at, again, frigates. Super chat by Royo asks, USS South Dakota bombarded Kamaishi? She raised the signal, never forget Pearl Harbor. Did she have to spell out the signal, or was there a shortcut? I'm pretty sure you could get never forget out of a combination of standard signal flags from the International Code of Signals. I mean, I don't think there is a never forget phraseology, but never or something approximating that, and forget or something approximating that, you could probably patch together out of the International Code of Signals. Pearl Harbor, I suspect, would have had to have been spelt out unless there was a specific harbor designation flag within the US Navy's signal code book itself, in which case they could have used that. But if they were using the standard International Code of Signals, then Pearl Harbor would definitely have had to been spelt out. Random British guy asks, the Dutch start the 1047 program a year or two early and have a hull or two completed and slowly working up, and the Dutch have the foresight to mobilise early. Could they survive? Yes, if they're working up, so they're still not complete, they're not been deployed to the Far East, but they are capable of sailing, and the Dutch mobilise early, then it's entirely possible that the semi-complete 1047s could make the relatively short dash, as did a bunch of other Dutch ships, over to the UK and set up as the Free Dutch Navy serving the Dutch government in exile. Now, they would be fairly significant targets for the Luftwaffe, so if it was the first half of the question, I'd say no, because the Luftwaffe would probably target them without mercy. But if the Dutch have got the foresight to mobilise early, then they've also got the foresight, theoretically, to move some extra defences around their harbour and make sure that they sail with the rest of the Dutch fleet that managed to get away from the Netherlands, and therefore have a reasonable amount of escort until they can get under RAF fighter cover. And Desert Foxo says, did carriers in World War II take over the role of sea control and interdiction from the battle cruiser? If so, how did the method of sea control was gained change between them doctrinally? Sea control and interdiction. I don't think so, no. Because in World War II, the cruiser was still doing a lot of the sea control and interdiction role. So you don't really see, outside of escort carriers, you don't see, which are mostly doing sub hunting, you don't see carriers generally doing blockade runner hunts, surface raider hunts, etc., etc. Apart from anything, they're too vulnerable for that kind of thing. So from a larger perspective, the cruiser is basically retaking over its role from the battle cruiser in most of that. And then in the straight up active combat zones, the carriers are still very fragile. They still have to stay fairly far back. So although carrier air power eventually gives you, to a certain extent, gives you sea control and allows you to interdict, the thing is, because a ship can be there 24/7 until its fuel runs out. An aircraft can only be in any given place for a few hours before its fuel runs out and it has to go back home. So I would say World War II air power and carriers allow... They create an environment in which it is much easier to take sea control and interdict the enemy, but they do not in and of themselves give you them. A Derp Squad saying, is there not a flag shorthand for the word harbour? Possibly. I mean, I've usually seen it defined as port, but that could be treated as a synonym for harbour, I guess. This is the thing, because you've got the International Code of Signals, and then you've got the individual navies' variations on that for specific cases. So, maybe. The Judge YT says, my question is too long for YouTube Super Chats. Can I DM you on Discord? Sure. I'm very tired. Yeah, you can DM me. I might not answer it in this stream, but I certainly will answer it. Vintage Car History says, I followed your advice for 2 years and my channel is about where yours was at that time. What is in store for me over the next 5 years? Well, assuming the trend, assuming that your channel follows a similar trend to mine, which obviously I can't necessarily guarantee because slightly different topics and also very different YouTube landscape these days, but assuming that everything roughly tracks, what you would be expecting in the next year or so would be maybe for a particular video to inexplicably go semi-viral and people just catch on to it, and that gives you your big boost in subscriber numbers that then persuades YouTube that it should be telling more people about you, and then things spiral on and upwards from there really, at which point, you know, hang on for the ride and hope it lasts. Excuse me. Sapper Ninja asks, the Austin Allegro is famous for being more aerodynamic backwards than forwards. Are there any ships like this? Quite a few, actually. I mean, assuming that their rear superstructures are somewhat aerodynamically shaped, most ships that lack a superfiring aft turret are probably technically slightly more aerodynamic backwards, because there's less immediate air resistance. Usually the quarter deck is a bit lower as well, so if you've got lower quarter deck, which means less air resistance from the hull, you've only got one turret, so less air resistance from that. Then assuming the rear superstructure, which is also relatively small, is vaguely wedge-shaped pointing backwards, that means what's now the front of the ship is going to pose significantly less aerodynamic resistance than the front of the ship, the actual front. And I mean, sure, then the back of what used to be the forward superstructure and everything will provide a fair degree of resistance. But at that point, you'll have been entered into the turbulent air zone created by the initial part of the ship moving through the air, which mitigates to a certain extent, although not entirely, what's then going to happen afterwards. But obviously that's aerodynamic, that's not hydrodynamic. The hydrodynamics are a completely different matter, and hydrodynamically the ship is much, much better going forward. Fleet of Ocean says, out of the ships we reviewed and looked over at in the ramblings on Treasure Planet Battle at Procyon, which was your favourite? I would say my favourite is probably either the I forget what it's called, the Starhammer, basically the massive star mortar carrying Royal Navy ship, because getting up close and personal and dropping a 5-cluster Nova mortar on people is funny. Or I'm going to say probably the frigate, because I like the full-scale up and down sails. And occasionally menacing people with submersible ironclads is also funny. Big Man Inc. asks, given how high the casualties were for the Americans on 13th of November 1942, can it be claimed as a US Pyrrhic victory since the Japanese Navy returned the next night? So the American date system always confuses me slightly. I was like, hang on, there's no 13th month. Yes, of course, that's the night action, first night action of the Battle of Guadalcanal, which again is a terribly named battle, but nonetheless, Callahan's skirmish. Could it be claimed as a US Pyrrhic victory? Given that the Japanese Navy returned the next night, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a Pyrrhic victory, because I mean, victories are usually defined by two sets of circumstances. Firstly, who's lost the most people or units, and secondly, who's conceded the field. Usually, if you concede the field, you have lost, even if you manage to inflict slightly higher levels of casualties on your opponents. I mean, in the wider context of things, yes, it temporarily ran the US out of sort of nearby operational cruisers in the local area. But overall, considering that the Japanese had an objective to fulfill that wasn't fight the enemy, and they failed to do that, they didn't manage to bombard Henderson Field, and they took a bunch of losses, plus they took the single biggest loss, even if they came back again for more the next night, it's given the casualties the US suffered, it's not an ideal US victory, but it still, I would say, is a US victory. Texas Anla Shock asks, what is a naval event that you think could be reasonably adapted into a science fiction story that hasn't been already? Well, it depends how close you want to get, but because the thing is, there's a lot of epic battles, and I'm sure if you trace them back far enough, you could probably point to various other actual naval battles. I would say if you want to say specific naval battle or naval event that could be adapted into a science fiction story that hasn't already, probably the fight of Indefatigable and Amazon versus Droit de l'Homme. I'm not sure anyone's done that as a sci-fi story yet, and you'd have to involve a lot of space scenery and space storms to properly adapt it, but it could be done, certainly. And then our last super chat, after which I'll grab another few bits of beef, and then we'll go into chat questions from general chat. This is from Republic of New Carolina Joint Chiefs of Staff. April Fool's question. If the large fancy officer hats of the Age of Sail remained the standard uniform, which navy would you think would issue the fanciest and largest hat during 1900 to 1950? And which commander would look best in these fancier hats? Okay. Fancy hats. I mean, if it's in the Age of Sail, if they're keeping their Age of Sail standard uniforms, or keeping the hats from the standard uniforms going through, then it's going to probably be a three-way race between Britain, Spain, and France, because they're the ones with the biggest navies. They're the ones who are in the most active conflict. They're the ones who are going to be trying to outdo each other all the time. Of which... I think the French Navy would have the fanciest hat, but I think the Royal Navy would have the largest hat. If you look at some of the stovepipe hats of the 19th century, I think that the Royal Navy would basically end up having a hat so insanely large it could be mistaken for a small funnel, but the French would have by far the fanciest and best looking hats. And then Ray Giordano says, thank you for all the great naval history. You're perfectly welcome. Graham W. Kidd saying, Drac live on Anzac Day, Tuesday. A coincidence? Well, it's still Monday here for another hour and 23 minutes. Hour and 22 minutes. Right. So, that's the super chats for the minute. I'm just going to take another quick bite and then we'll be into chat from the, questions from regular chat. Sorry, I thought I'd re-enabled the microphone. Right. Sean Riley asks, you are in an airsoft battle with Admirals King, Lee, Fisher, Nelson, and Rozesvensky. Who wins? Lee. I mean, King and Fisher would be charging headlong and trying to melee you as much as anything else. Rozesvensky would find the biggest automatic weapon and just be hosing the area down. Nelson would have probably fitted a bayonet and gone charging. Admiral Yi would be carefully ambushing people and picking them off probably with a DMR, but Lee would, you wouldn't see Lee the entire battle. You would just occasionally hear a faint pop and then be hit by a sniper round from the middle of nowhere. So Admiral Lee would definitely win that. Ramal asks, in terms of your education and degree, are you going to try and get a doctorate degree in history, if not in engineering? It's possibly on the long-term cards. The thing is, if I'm going to do a PhD, I have to do a PhD whilst also being able to, keep up with the channel and do everything else that needs doing. Which, as Mrs. Drac can tell you, it's a fairly busy life already. But then on the other hand, Chris from Military Aviation History is running his channel and doing a PhD at the same time. I'm not entirely sure how he does it, but if he's willing to share his secrets with me, that may be a course of action to go down. What topic would I do? I mean, come on, I'm going to go for a PhD in naval and maritime history. What else? At least at that point, I can be working on stuff for my PhD which is also happens to be, doing scripts and research for the channel as well, which is quite good. Hello, Max Munsterman, or Mr. Man, I think. USS Grey Ghost said USS Grey Ghost says, you once said that some US ships of the line were too maneuverable. How can a ship of the line have too much maneuverability? Basically, if a ship of the line has too short a length to beam ratio, it will be incredibly agile, but it will also have a great amount of difficulty maintaining a straight line course. This is kind of the great quandary, especially in the age of sail, but even these days, that ships have to solve. If you make them long and thin, they tend to go really quick relative for their displacement, but they also take forever and a day to turn. If you make them really short and fat, they'll turn on a dime, but they'll never go in a straight line. And somewhere in between, they'll go reasonably quickly and turn reasonably agilely, and then it's all down to the finer details. And so, yeah, sometimes you can get that equation a little bit wrong either side of things. Dexter Sample, do you think the Montanas could have stood up to the Yamatos? Yeah, they're not directly comparable because they follow slightly different design philosophies, but a Montana versus a Yamato would be a reasonably fair fight. It mostly come down to the technology. Once you incorporate the fact that Montanas will have the latest all singing, all dancing radar-guided fire control, that gives them a huge leg up. In a straight-up daytime fight, fine weather, no clouds in the sky, gentle sunlight, very little waves, the sheer hitting power of the Yamato's 18-inch shells, which is still a little bit more than the 16-inch 50 super heavy shells, it does stand the Yamato in a little bit better stead on a shell-for-shell basis, but the fact the Montana has 3 extra main guns, yeah, that kind of more than makes up for it. Shadow49 asks, on plans for the USS Texas's engine, I found a note that said crankshaft will be marked to show the position of prop blades. Why would you need to know it in the engine room while in service? Off the top of my head, a number of things. If you are going into harbour, you might not want a propeller blade sticking right out horizontally out from the hull. That could get damaged. If something goes wrong and the shaft needs to be stopped, you need to send out a diver. Being able to say, well, you're going to find the prop at this angle would be quite useful. Yeah, there's a few more practical, mundane reasons why you would possibly want to know where exactly the prop blades were lining up with the crankshaft. The other thing as well is if something goes wrong, say you start getting a vibration on the prop shaft, then knowing where the prop blades are might help you diagnose what's going on. Because if you're getting a vibration and you can tell, okay, well, the vibration is definitely occurring more so on this vector than any of the others, and then you stop things, someone pops their head down in a diver suit and goes, well, yeah, there's a socking great chunk taken out of one of the prop blades. And you say, well, which one was it? Oh, it's the one that's kind of at 12 o'clock. You look at the 12 o'clock position on your prop shaft, say, yep, that lines up with that prop blade. Turn around, oh, yeah, that's the problem. Yeah, so there's a bunch of reasons. If the props are quite happily spinning away whilst the ship's proceeding at 18 or 21 knots, you probably don't need to know all that much how the prop blades align with the crankshaft, but there are a lot of smaller circumstances where you do. Green Sea Ships asks, about when can we expect to see your USS Midway tour video? Well, it's the next one on the list, so in terms of the USA 2022 tour, because we've just done Iowa, so Midway will be due to come out next month at some point. And then Alabama in June, and then Wisconsin in July, and then that's the US 2022 tour done. Believe it or not. Vicky asks, why did the Miscellaneous, with their high uninterrupted superstructure preventing cross-deck firing, use echelon wing turrets given the increased length and torsional stresses that this produces? Partly because the Brazilians were obsessed with having the most heavily armed battleship in the world, and the engine basically the technology at the time meant they'd either, if they wanted to have the most heavily armed, most heavy broadside battleship in the world, they'd either have to get something much bigger, which they didn't want to pay for, or they have to accept echelon wing turrets, or they'd have to accept triple stack super firing turrets, which would be horrific for stability. Plus, at that stage, the engines are still taking up a good chunk of space. Bear in mind the Miscellaneous are vertical triple expansion powered, kind of like the Nassau's. So there just isn't the space midships to stick those turrets whatever way you want to stick them to give you, your 6 turret broadside. So an echelon at least gives you a 5 turret broadside. Sean Raleigh, I'm not down under yet, so we're planning to go to Australia in June. But then I will be. So at that point, if I do a live stream from Australia, I'm very, very tempted to just flip the camera upside down just because. Knight 6831, where did you get the idea for the Duquesne and Pensacola class, whose protection against anything more than a stiff breeze could best be described as optimistic? Basically because the Duquesnes basically don't have armor. They have armor that can protect them from a destroyer's high explosive shell, and that's really about it. The occasional destroyer that shows up with semi-armor piercing, or a cruiser that shows up with pretty much anything, can punch through the Duquesne's armor to the extent that if it's doing anything, all it's doing is guaranteeing that the fuse is being set off in the shell, and or creating even more shrapnel to do damage to the internal parts of the ship. And the Pensacolas, I mean, they're a bit better off than the Duquesnes, but they're still not particularly brilliant. Now, the Pensacolas are somewhat better protected against destroyer gunfire than the Duquesnes are, fair enough, although not exactly a high bar to clear. But if the Pensacolas ended up having to go toe-to-toe with other cruisers, then, by all reasonable measures, their armor serves basically, again, just as a guarantee that the shell's actually going to arm and detonate once it gets into the ship instead of going through and through, which is one of the things that makes the Battle of Komodorsky Islands so remarkable, because of course the second of the Pensacolas, the Salt Lake City, manages to take on, albeit at a heavy cost to itself, a couple of Japanese cruisers that on paper should have beaten it 6 ways from Sunday, and it didn't lose, which, that's, at that point you've really got to admire the Salt Lake City. Naval DMR, yes, DMR designated marksman rifle, which at most airsoft sites means semi-automatic fire only, and usually a minimum engagement distance. But you can fire at a higher muzzle velocity than full auto guns can. Ben Motovlogs asks, why is Hood so beloved in the UK and elsewhere? Partly it's a case of she was the kind of the Royal Navy's flagship to a certain degree in the interwar period. She's fairly big and impressive, which appeals to people, and because she was the flagship and she's big and impressive, propaganda played her up quite a bit. Plus, of course, her rather spectacular end. It attracts people for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why, but it does. So yeah, Hood, and of course there's the tragic ending of all the men. That, you know, something like that will affect a lot of people, and as a result, as that effect spreads through their family and friends, and their family and friends, people have a bit more of a connection to it, even if they never actually maybe lost a relative there. Jacob Moss says, following a prompt for the 1047 question, assuming the 1047 sailed for Britain with open barbettes with no turrets and no secondaries, what do the British arm them with? Oh boy, because at that point, the twin 15s for Vanguard are already earmarked. I suppose they could give them twin 13.5s. They're probably still in. I mean, there's probably still enough of those around at the beginning of the war to maybe do at least one of them. Yeah. I mean, twin 13.5s are probably the next most likely answer, at least for one of those ships. Let's think. Yeah, off the top of my head, I can't really think of anything else that doesn't require them to manufacture a bunch of big gun turrets, which will take quite a while. Alex Lamb, if you were the Admiralty, would you prefer getting the 3 Courageous class conversions or 2 carriers based on Admiral class? 2 carriers based on Admiral class by a long way. Yes, S. Grego says, I have a question too long for YouTube. Can I at it to you on Discord? You can, but I mean, I can only keep track of 1 or 2 chats at once. So you can at it to me on Discord, but I'm probably not going to be able to catch it while I'm, you know, doing this stream. Oh boy, it's going up to 11 o'clock and I'm feeling remarkably tired. So how long are we going? 2 hours 27. Wow, it's not been that long and it feels like forever. Okay, I'm going to keep going as much as I can, but to be perfectly honest, and apologies again for the late start because of that ridiculous issue with XSplit, which is why you've got the wonders of this messy background. I'll keep going, but I can't guarantee I'm going to be able to keep going for more than another 10-15 minutes or so before I'm just going to pass out. It's been a heck of a day. 1275 GT, have you thought about doing videos on smaller boats, landing craft, gunboats and similar? I have done. I have thought about it, and I will do at some point in the future. It's just, as with most things related to the channel these days, good things come to those who wait. Sam Hopkinson, the metal scaffolding looking structures near the stern on the side of several interwar destroyer designs, what are they? They're propeller guards. So the propellers are large enough and the sterns of destroyers slim enough that the radius of the action of the propeller actually extends out past the water level extent of the hull. So what those prop guards are there for is so that if the ship's coming in to dock or something's passing by it, then instead of getting the dock chewed up by the propellers and the propellers getting broken or the propellers taking a chunk out of a passing ship, those prop guards make sure that they don't come into contact. Michael Kovacic asks, at Meuse-Kabir, which British battleship fired the fatal shot at Britannia? I think no ship is officially credited, but it'd be interesting to know since killing a battleship with another battleship is a very rare feat. I don't know offhand. I'd have to go back to the action logs from that point. In fact, actually, even the action logs probably won't say. I think to figure it out reliably, I think you'd probably have to go back to the deck logs of each ship, then work out what, if any, time differences there are between them, and then see if you can time the salvos. Because you would be able to figure out the distance, therefore the time of flight, and you would probably then be able to figure out which ship did the fatal shot. But I don't know offhand. Jack Maresco, are there any good books that cover the B-65 large cruisers or the various designs that turned into the Yamato? There is for the Yamato designs, yes. Just call up the name of it. Yeah, so if you can find it, there's Capital Ships of the Imperial Japanese Navy 1868 to 1945, the Yamato class and subsequent planning. That's by Hans Lengra and Lars Ullberg. Don't get the ebook version, by the way. For some bizarre reason, it's just the first 3 chapters. But if you can find that, that goes through a lot of the preliminary stuff. Where the heck? There we go. Emperor Dave, would Japan have been better building a modernised number 13 class compared to a Yamato? Higher speed, 1 less gun, same armour, 5/7 of the displacement and cost. Probably not, because you're also going to get early 1920s torpedo defense and I mean, for what it's worth, slightly worse anti-aircraft capability and less ability to incorporate new anti-aircraft weapons on board. I mean, yeah, it didn't do the Yamatos much good, but you don't want to objectively make it worse. And you'd have to go through the expense of modernising the design, so you'd end up with basically something that's not quite as good at doing this kind of job. I mean, a modernised number 13 wouldn't be awful, but a Yamato could probably still beat it in a straight up fight, and the cost and displacement issues are slightly less important than the fact that Japan just doesn't have that many big shipyard slipways. So if you're going to build a big ship like a number 13 or a Yamato, you may as well go for broke, because just because you're saving a bit of money doesn't mean you're going to have another slipway to put another ship on. Excuse me. Vicky asks, I meant, why use N echelon turrets instead of placing the wing turrets directly opposite each other? I mean, kind of like Dreadnought. If I remember correctly, it's to do with how the barbettes and the magazines of the turrets interact with all the other spaces, including machinery spaces down below. And if you put the 2 wing turrets parallel to each other, the resulting gap in the middle wouldn't be large enough for some of the other stuff they had to do further down in the hull. Whereas by offsetting it, then you could have machinery rooms or whatever could be offset a little bit to one side, but then they'd occupy the rest of the hull width. Whereas there wasn't there wouldn't be any useful hull width between two parallel sets of barbettes and magazines. Certainly nothing you'd want to put there. I mean, putting obviously a high temperature boiler between two sets of Cordat magazines is not really a good plan for anybody's long-term existence. Redlin 5. What elements of the German World War I Navy in terms of design would you rate as good to the best or best of their contemporaries? Let's see. World War One. I mean, their submarines are pretty solid. Destroyers, no, not really. Some of their later cruisers or light cruisers are pretty good. Pre-World War One, maybe not so much. They tend to be a bit on the lighter side, but certainly their wartime light cruiser production is pretty decent. Their last generation armoured cruisers, the Scharnhorsts, some of the best armoured cruisers produced. Blucher probably is one of, if not the best armoured cruiser ever produced, unfortunately. It ends up being lumped in with the battle cruisers. Excuse me. German battle cruisers, well, I mean, they're basically only competing with British battle cruisers, so, you know, it's not exactly a wide field. German capital ship design's an interesting one. They're coming on at a fairly good pace, a bit of a leap. They're coming on leaps and bounds, but I would say that German battle cruiser design, towards the end, when you're looking at things like the Mackensons, is really good, but earlier on, although you get early ships like Seydlitz and von der Tam being very, very durable, compared to what they could have ended up going against, they're maybe not quite as good. It sounds like Floppy's waking up. Vank asks, did you get a chance to check out much else besides Sackville whilst you were in Halifax? Yeah, there's a couple of really good museums right near Sackville that were pretty good. The rest of the crew got to practice axe throwing. I got to see a modern Canadian warship up close and personal. And what else did we do? There was something else we did. It wasn't directly naval history related. I think it was food related. But we weren't there for very long. I think we were there for 2 or 3 days max. Captain Seaforth asks, some of the Royal Navy 30-knot torpedo boat destroyers served in the West Indies. How did they even get there? As far as I'm aware, the narrowest part of the Atlantic is wider than their range. Were they towed, resupplied at sea, or carried? Probably towed. I think if they're the ships I'm thinking of. The torpedo boat destroyers were small enough to be towed. You don't want to try and resupply at sea with coal at the best of times, let alone pre-World War One in the middle of the Atlantic with a little torpedo boat destroyer. And only really the second class torpedo boats could be carried. So yeah, it's pretty much it's going to be towing, or motoring along at very slow speeds. Warham Payne State says, did you get to see about Alabama? Yep, I did. I saw Alabama after Midway. Michael Kovacic, why weren't more large frigates like Constitution or Endymion built? Because they were very expensive and you could only have a few of them. For small powers like the US, it made sense. For the British, it made less sense because you needed lots of frigates, so spending money on a few big frigates wasn't really worth it unless everybody else had them. And this was the thing, with Constitution and Endymion, they were the high-end ships of the period, but once they showed the capabilities of that kind of design, and then that design then people started to build more and more of them, and thus they became kind of the new standard. So if you look at the 1820s, 1830s era frigates, they're much more along the lines of a Constitution or an Endymion than they are of the 5th and 6th rates of the past. Also, if you rasate a first rate, what would be the advantages? How much speed could you get out of them? If you rasate a first rate down to, well, at that point it would be a third rate. Yes, it would be a third rate. You probably get depending on the design, maybe between 1 to 3 knots additional on the design. The advantage would be you'd have a full first rate set of rigging propelling a much lighter vessel, and that much lighter vessel would have a gun battery that's made up entirely of, assuming it's, let's say, a British first rate of 32 and 24 pounders, or a French or Spanish one of 36 and 24 pounders, which, yeah, that's quite the terrifying broadside for anything. I mean, you'd have the world's most powerful third rate by a long, long way. Poor Floppy. Why are you getting up, Floppy? Hello.
Just turning.
Just turning over. Lazy little thing. Mind you, it is quite late. He's probably complaining because we've not gone to sleep yet. Right, it's now 11, so I'm going to do 3 or 4 more questions, and then I'm going to call it. So slightly shorter than usual, but it has been a heck of a day. I made a US Navy grade ice cream earlier. That's going to be fun to test tomorrow. Galda Iona says, you've been guesting on a lot of other channels lately. Yeah, it's been quite fun. Any other cool collabs planned in the near future? Yes, so hopefully we should have upcoming in the next couple of months. Going to be talking about the Punic Wars, the first Punic War between Rome and Carthage. We are going to do... Oh my goodness. Hopefully I've got a night fighting and Eastern Solomons lineups with John Partial and Trent Hone. So that should be quite nice. Russian and Soviet battleships. You remember I got Russian and Soviet battleships reprinted. I managed, lucky enough, to get an interview with the author, Steve McLaughlin, who's a wonderful man. So that's coming up. There's going to be at least one more. There's going to be in the long-term future a bunch of collabs, but there's in the short term, myself and Matt Easton, we're going to go and talk about, continuing our coverage of the Crimean War. We're going to look at the small arms and some of the bigger arms of the Royal Navy on land during the Crimean War, because there was a very large naval brigade element in the Crimean War. So, rifles, pistols, melee weapons, and the siege guns, which were naval guns they pulled off and put into the siege batteries around Sevastopol. That's going to be a collab that's coming up. I've got 1 or 2 others in the pipeline as well that remain semi-classified, but we shall see. And a big special guest. Trent Hone and John Partial, absolutely excellent. It's not like they're saying they're small; they're really good guests. But there's one person I've been hoping to get on as a special guest for a very long time, and hopefully that's going to work out at some point soon. Gregory Wright says, is there a way to use deck or ship logs to confirm time notations are in sync? What events do you look for? There is. the main thing you have to look out for is remarkable events or events are happening on other ships that are coded across multiple logs. So, for example, if you have, well, let's take the case of Mirz El Kabir. If you have Britannia exploding, if Ark Royal's log says that that happens at one time, and Hood's log says that happens at 3 minutes after Ark Royal's log does, and one of the other capital ships that's present says that actually happened 2 minutes before Ark Royal's log says that it happened, well, now that actually tells you, well, we know this was the same event, but they're all recording it happening over a 5-minute spread between them. That tells you they're out of sync. So at that point, you can then you then either, if you want to be as close as possible to accurate, trying to work out which of these ships' logs is actually the most accurate and on time in terms of closest to actual time, but that can be almost impossible, at which point you would make an educated best guess and say, right, well, we're going to sync everything to this log, at which point it may not necessarily be the actual accurate, this is what happened at that exact moment. It may be that maybe one of the other logs is closer in accuracy for time, and you're now a couple of minutes faster, a couple of minutes slow. But the important thing is that all the logs sync to the same time, which means that when somebody fires a salvo and then 30 seconds later there's a massive explosion, you can go, oh, right, well, the only ship that fired a salvo 30 seconds before Britannia exploded is this ship, for example. So, yeah, it'll be either something external happening, like an enemy ship exploding, or something that happens to, or is ordered by all, that's observed by all the ships. So, one of your own ships taking a hit, or the admiral making a specific signal. When is that signal recorded as on the various ships as, oh yeah, we saw him make this signal, kind of thing. Green Sea Ship saying, if Floppy is small, you didn't name him Johnson. He's not that small. He's bigger than a fully grown whippet already, and as big as a small-sized, fully grown greyhound. And he's bigger than he was last week. He's growing pretty darn quick. Vinayak Glee says, big fan from Nicaragua. Hey, that's cool. Not too many, I suspect, online watching from Nicaragua, but if you are, welcome aboard. Daniel Taylor says, did you follow Tasting History's Navy ice cream recipe? I did for one of them. And as you'll find out in the video, assuming it all goes to plan on and goes up on Wednesday, there are actually two separate baseline recipes for US Navy ice cream. The one that Tasting History did, and which I've also done my best to replicate, is what I would call the fancier one. That's the one that would be made for special occasions, made for officers, etc., simply because it requires a lot more preparation and equipment. Whereas if you just want to churn stuff out en masse, the US Navy also uses dry mix. Now, I understand. Now, obviously, for a channel like Tasting History, where it's like, here is a recipe, here is a thing that we are actually making, going, here's some dry mix, here's some water or milk in a bowl, whisk, stick it in the ice cream maker, job done. That's nowhere near as interesting. You know, that's understandable. But ultimately, if you were eating ice cream in the US Navy, the vast majority of them are going to be eating dry mix. Well, not dry mix directly, but dry mix that's been turned into ice cream. There'd still be a good chunk of the ice cream that would be served following Tasting History's recipe, but I've made both, and you'll see why and how I'm using them when we get there. And, well, at the moment, they're chilling in the freezer, so I don't know. Will it even work? Let's find out. Megascrow says, Scott Manley. I'd love to have Scott Manley on as a guest. I have no idea how I'd manage to do that. Because really, given that he covers space stuff, the only two things that immediately come to mind that we could talk about where it's common ground would be the battleship turret rotation and elevation mechanisms, which are built into the Jodrell Bank telescope, space telescope, and the fact that early on tracking of space launches in the early space program was done almost exclusively using World War II era anti-aircraft fire control rangefinder and tracking systems, because they were the only things capable of zooming in and tracking at the rate that was needed. Daniel Taylor says British muzzleloaders did an outstanding series on a battle at Sevastopol. Well, excellent. I'm very glad to hear it. British muzzleloaders, I do like them. Right. And finally, final two questions. Nick Trains 22. How was your video with the Tank Museum organised? They reached out to me, basically, and I was like, yeah, of course I am. Of course I will happily go and film there. I've been to Tank Fest and the Tank Museum quite a lot, so I was quite honoured and happy to go and film with them. The selection process was a little bit harder though, because if you asked me for my personal top 5 tanks and my personal bottom 5 tanks, you'd get a slightly different list. But of course, I'm known for doing naval history, so I thought, well, let's make them naval-maritime themed, which for the most part usually meant how good were they at being amphibious, because there's not too many seagoing tanks. And that's why you get some slightly odd listings on there, because some tanks as tanks, I guess, obviously not being necessarily my speciality, but as tanks are not necessarily that brilliant or that awful. But when the confluence comes over with their amphibious capabilities, those in particular might be really good or really bad. So you might get a tank that everyone else thinks, this is brilliant, or what's this, it's not that awful, but I might rate it really well or really badly based purely on whether or not the flipping thing stays afloat when you stick it in the water. Right, so that, I believe, I'm going to wrap everything up there with just the final comment from Sapper Ninja. Did you ever expect to be sitting in a frontline Russian tank in the T-55? Not voluntarily. But see, this is one of the beautiful things about being able to collaborate with places like the Tank Museum, is that you get to do stuff that you would never have otherwise thought that you could, which is fantastic. This is one of, as if you've seen the video I did with the video of the presentation I did at WNHA, the Western Naval History Association conference back in February this year. For me, a good chunk of what makes this job so nice is that, as a teenager and as a young adult, I would and still do read books by naval authors, and I'd be like, oh, these guys they sound really good. They know their stuff. Now I get to meet them. I'd look at museum ships and go, well, I can visit Victory and Warrior and Mary Rose and Belfast, but there's all these cool things in America that I'm never going to get to visit. And now I can visit them. Now I can talk to people who crewed them. Now I can talk to the people who look after them. I get to do all this stuff that even back, as I said, as a teenager, just as an enthusiast, I was like, I'd really like to do this stuff, but I'm never going to get to do it. Now I can. That in and of itself makes it worth it. Plus, I get to meet a bunch of other like-minded guys who, for some reason, have been sat around listening to me talk for nearly 3 hours, whilst I've been very tired and fighting with XSplit. So, thanks everyone for that as well. And unfortunately, this was not the live stream debut of Floppy, because Floppy has decided he's going to go and hide behind the table and just growl and moan at everyone from the sidelines. But at some point, maybe next live stream, he might be a little bit more lively. So, see you all in a few weeks, hopefully, and it's time to say goodnight.